Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ruby Chandy. I'm SM 89, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this faculty session on climate research at MIT. As you may know, at her 2023 inauguration, MIT's president, Sally Kornbluth, called climate change and its mounting consequences the greatest scientific and societal challenge of this or any age. She called for a grand creative enterprise at MIT for uniting our strengths and capabilities to address this important challenge. This effort was formalized this year in 2024 as the Climate Project at MIT and is designed as a model of accelerated university-led innovation to marshal the resources and capabilities across the Institute to help change the planet's climate trajectory. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Christopher Knittel. Professor Knittel is the George P. Schultz Professor of Energy Economics and a Professor of Applied Economics here at MIT Sloan. His research has appeared in the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Industrial Economics, the Energy Journal, and other academic journals. He holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from California State University, Stanislaus, an MA in Economics from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley. MIT Sloan is a key part of the Climate Project, and he joins us today to discuss MIT Sloan's new Climate Policy Center and how the center will have a positive impact on MIT's mission to fight climate change.
Great. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, everyone. This is an amazing crowd. Clearly, you don't see what it's like outside. I've been running the core for the last few years, the core micro class, and if you remember the term opportunity cost, you're paying a high opportunity cost right now to listen to me. So I very much appreciate that. I hope to talk a little bit about what Sloan is doing in the space of climate change and how that fits within MIT's project more broadly. And I want to start by saying that this is in its infancy. The Climate Policy Center is in its infancy. We're really doing a listening tour as much as a speaking tour about what the Policy Center is about. So I'm going to try to end with an ample amount of time to hear from you as to how we might improve on the vision of the Policy Center, and hopefully we could continue that conversation even after today. So I'll start by saying that, look, MIT for the last few decades and even longer has been in the thick of things in terms of doing climate-related research and environmental research more generally. Here's just a few snippets of the types of research projects that have gone on at MIT focused on climate change. And I think they've been quite impactful, not only in academia, but outside of academia. But what I want to focus on today is the whole mission of the Climate Policy Center is to amplify our impact, not among other universities. I think MIT has one of the best names and the best reputations in climate change research and environmental research more generally with universities. But I do feel as though we've been punching below our weight, so to speak, in places like DC or in Sacramento or at the UN and so on. So the main point of the Climate Policy Center is to amplify that impact that we have among policymakers themselves. And what I want to talk about today is our idea of how to do that. So Ruby talked about President Kornbluth's mission. In 2021, Raphael Reif, our former president, also laid out a fast-forward climate action plan that we've been working from for the past few years. And that, too, had very great ideas, I think rallied a fair bit of resources to work on climate policy, climate change more generally. And as the current climate plan did, it leaned heavily on the technology side of MIT and the entrepreneur and the innovation side of MIT, and as well as the education part and the empowering of the next generation to solve this big problem. And that, of course, also impacts our undergraduates and our undergraduate and graduate education. Then Sally came along a couple years ago, or I guess about a year ago now, and really doubled down on climate. Of course, when Sally first came here, all the people working on climate were a little bit worried that it wasn't going to be a focus of hers. She was a biologist, you never quite know what they're going to focus on. But every meeting I was in, climate was the first thing she talked about. And she didn't, even meetings where it wasn't all the people working on climate. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention, I spent all morning trying to teach 4-year-olds how to play baseball. So if anyone gets out of line, you're going to do a lap around E62 and come back, okay? So no more outbursts. All right. So what did Sally do? So one, she put down money. Very needed resources to fund and coalesce research around climate change. A $50 million investment over 2 years that's going to focus on a few topic areas that I'm going to get to in a second. But as MIT does, the point here is to not only develop the technology, but to deliver it and scale it up. So it's going to lean heavily on that historic reputation MIT has of not just inventing the stuff, but getting it out in the marketplace. The topic areas that she laid out in her plan are 5. The first is, look, if we're going to decarbonize things, we're going to need to decarbonize buildings. That means the HVAC system, the cooking systems, and so on. So the first thing is thinking about how do we decarbonize buildings and build resilient cities. Then we need a whole set of industries to decarbonize, whether it's steel, petrochemicals, you name it, fertilizers, and so on. So we need new technologies in that space to decarbonize a wide variety of industries. We can't ignore the fact that we've been harming the atmosphere and the oceans and the land. So another topic area is focused on inventing new ways to rectify those where they are now and to get them back to a better state. Climate justice and climate policy justice is a big topic now. Another focus areas is going to be to focus on frontline cities and communities, so to speak, develop ways to decarbonize the economy in a way that's just and equitable across not just racial lines or income lines, but across geographies as well. And then finally, and this is not the Climate Policy Center that I'm going to focus on, but one of the focus areas of the project is also on policy. And how does this differ from the Climate Policy Center is that this focus area within the project is going to be thinking about new policies, inventing new policies and new institutions that will allow us to decarbonize the economy in a faster way and scale up those technologies that I just talked about. That's the project. So that's the MIT level climate focus that Sally has put forth. Separate from that, but obviously related, is the investment that Sloan has made in climate. And it's funny, it was around November that I sat here talking with the Sloan faculty and staff at a faculty staff meeting, laying out our vision for a climate policy center that would be housed in Sloan. Former Dean Schmidtlein asked me to do that. About 2 weeks later, Dean Schmidtlein asked me into his office. You never quite know what's going to happen, right? Should I pack my bags or... And he sat me at his table and said, I've told Sally that I've committed $25 million to create a climate policy center. And I'd like you to run it along with other faculty and staff at Sloan to heighten the impact of not only Sloan, but all of MIT in terms of climate policy center. So that $25 million investment, every day I thank Dean Schmidtlein for that. Georgia came in, Dean Perakis came in. She could have pulled the rug right out from it. She didn't. So I thank her too for the continued support that she has shown for the Climate Policy Center. And we've just launched. So like I said, we're in our infancy, and I just want to kind of give you a thank you very much. Yeah. I think we could do something great, and I'm going to lay out a framework for what that might look like, and I'm going to actually focus on a few early projects that we have going on that I think we're already having an impact. Okay. So this was not, like I said, a new idea that we had. Actually, it dates back to before 2021, but in 2021, myself, Bethany Patton, who's sitting right over there, who just so happens to be the executive director of the new MIT Climate Policy Center, and David Goldston, who's the director of the MIT Washington office, we've been talking for quite a long time about that issue that I brought up earlier, which is MIT is doing a lot of great work, but it's just not necessarily all getting into the hands of policymakers. And we laid out a vision for what it might look like, and we're kind of marching forward with that vision. We're updating it as we do this listening tour, but again, I think we're already having some impact in DC and on Beacon Hill. So what is the main idea here? A few main ideas. One is MIT needs a front door for policymakers. They need to know who to go to, even if they're just acting as the liaison, to connect them with the right faculty members on policy issues related to climate. So we want to be that front door. We will be leveraging existing centers, as I'm going to talk about, and existing faculty for the work that we do. So in many ways, we're just going to be amplifying existing people's research on campus, and being that front door will allow us to do that. How are we going to amplify the efforts? We're going to get in the trenches, so to speak, with policymakers. So it's not, well, okay, you're interested in building more transmission lines. Here's a Energy Journal publication on that topic. Senator Hickenlooper, why don't you go read that, and we'll be here to answer any questions. We're not going to do that. We're actually going to work with the policymakers themselves to analyze legislation, craft new legislation, understand the gaps in legislation. And that's very much how this is going to be a two-way street. So as we build these relationships, more and more policymakers will come to us, and we'll have a relationship that if we see some new results somewhere on campus that really needs to be translated into actual policy, we can take it to them. And we could help them craft legislation or rules within an agency that leverages that new work. In many ways, at least from me, I'm the academic among the three on the idea here, I've always seen three kind of issues with translating academic research into actual policy. The first is a little bit, I wouldn't say unique to MIT, but certainly a bigger issue at MIT. And that is that I don't know how well known this saying is, but at MIT we let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? Now, unfortunately, those flowers often don't talk to each other, or they don't even know another flower is out there. Right? They're just working in their lab, they're inventing really cool things, they're doing really great research, but they don't necessarily go out and see what else is going on. So that's one of the key missions of the Climate Policy Center, is to be the group on campus that can take the full stock of everything that's going on at MIT and understand how everything fits together and make those connections across faculty members. Or a lot of the great work that's being done is being done by hard scientists that don't really know policy, right? So we don't want them to do policy. We'll be the policy arm of that lab for them to translate that work into policy. The second thing that is definitely true across all of academia, is that we don't necessarily get credit for actually having a policy impact. I get credit for writing top-notch economic journal publications, right? And that's how it should be. I'm not saying that we should change all of academia here, but my main job is to push out the frontier in economics and to push out the frontier in economic sciences. So a lot of people might want to do more policy work, but don't necessarily have the incentive to do so, at least the academic incentive to do so. We'll do it for them. If they can choose how much they want to be involved in the process or how little they want to be involved in the process, but we'll take their work to the policymakers and work with the policymakers to translate that work into actual policy. And then the second, which is probably, or the third, the most important, believe it or not, it takes, at least in economics, it takes years to publish a paper. I'm just now putting out a paper in the Economic Journal that we first submitted in 2020. Yes, don't go into economics. It's ridiculous. I'm now publishing more in science journals just because of that. It turns out that if you go to a policymaker and you say, okay, we'll work on this with you, we'll have it done in 4 years, they're not going to really listen. They're going to be like, well, I'm going to be out of office in 4 years, so that's not going to be very helpful. So the third thing the Policy Center is going to do is going to more closely align the timeframes that we're talking about. Allow our researchers the flexibility and the time to work on things in weeks rather than months or years. And what does that look like? That looks like giving them more flexibility in terms of the projects that they're working on. So here's all the great work that's being done at MIT around climate. So I told you there's actually 1,000 flowers here, right? And so myself, I'm actually director of the MIT CEPR there. And I've been trying my hardest for the last 13 years, that's how I've been here, to keep stock on what's being done, but it's really hard when you have 3 other full-time jobs to know what's going on in the Plasma Science Infusion Center or the King Climate Action Initiative or the MIT Sustainability Consortia. There's just so much great work here that people don't necessarily know how it all fits together. So how are we going to do this? So the first, like I said, is get in the trenches with policymakers. Let them know how MIT research actually applies to actual legislation, actual policy. It might also, we'll definitely not be able to staff with just tenure-track faculty members, because tenure-track faculty members are focused on publishing in their discipline's top journals. So this is going to include postdocs and research scientists who get evaluated based not only on their academic publication record. We want them to do the academic research. We want them to also push out their discipline's frontier, but we can evaluate them on how many bills did you have direct impact, how many meetings did you have with staffers, how many meetings did you have at state legislatures, at city council members, and so on, to allow them to be incentivized to actually do the dirty work, so to speak, with those policymakers. And then once we build those relationships, we'll create that two-way street where we know what the policymakers are doing, they know what we're doing, and this two-way flow of information will just start to snowball and build on itself. Now, I do want to, so I always feel guilty standing up here saying that, academics aren't doing enough to have direct policy impact. Many are. I've been doing this my whole career because that's why I got into economics, to have an impact on actual policy. But to be honest, I've probably done it to the detriment of my academic career. So although many of us academics do work hand in hand with policymakers, we're not necessarily incentivized to do so. But people do it because we love it. That's a passion of ours. But what we want to take that passion and also give the researchers the direct incentive to build on that passion. More specific, so one of the great things about MIT is we have all of these really cool tools and resources that policymakers could be directly using right now. And many of them are, but again, we could amplify that work. And I'm going to talk about the inroads model in a second. But those types of models that we could put in front of staffers and policymakers so they can see exactly what MIT can do. The MIT Energy Initiative has a model that I'm going to talk about in a second called the Gen X model that has been used in academic research to understand what a decarbonized electricity system might look like. If we could put those models in the hands of the policymakers and their staff, then we could start to think about crafting new legislation, new policies that are informed based on those models. We want to convene. We want to get together and have this two-way flow of information and discussion with policymakers at a local, state, and federal, and even international level. And then lastly, which I've been kind of focused on already, is we want to actually take the tools in the yellow box to analyze specific legislation so that we can give the policymakers data so they can make more informed decisions. There's not going to be lobbying here. This isn't lobbying. This is providing policymakers with objective analysis and data so that they can make better decisions. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples that we have ongoing right now. But first I wanted to highlight some of the other faculty that are already working in the trenches, so to speak, with the Policy Center. The first is our brand new colleague that we stole from Berkeley in the fall, Catherine Wolfram. She's actually spent the last 2 years at the Treasury Department. She's been doing a lot of great work informing DC policymakers on what to think about and what are the issues around the Inflation Reduction Act, what's going to happen when the Trump tax cuts expire at the end of 2025, how could we leverage that as an opportunity to bring in more climate policy centers or climate policy that also builds revenues to cover some of the tax credit shortfalls. Florian Berg is a research scientist focused on ESG measurement, doing a lot of great work in working with places like the SEC and DC and policymakers thinking about what should ESG disclosures look like, what does the academic research say about that. John Sturman, who invented the En-ROADS model, is a champion of going out with speaking directly with policymakers so that they could better understand the costs and implications of climate change, not just at a macro level, but at a more local level. Those are just 3 examples of the researchers that are excited to join the Climate Policy Center efforts. So John's En-ROADS model, I don't know, show of hands, who's used it before? So if you haven't used it, I certainly encourage you to Google En-ROADS, E-N-ROADS, MIT. It's this beautiful model or website that collapses something that used to take a supercomputer to calculate in a matter of seconds. And it shows you what climate change is going to do at a local level, at a global level in terms of sea level rise, temperature rise, and so on. And what it does, the great part of it is it gives you these little sliders that you could think about amping up climate policy in specific sectors or specific policies, whether it's decarbonizing electricity or electrifying transportation and so on. And then it directly, within seconds, shows you the climate impacts of those efforts. Catherine, like I mentioned, has been going around to quite a few policymakers and locations thinking about what the new carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe means to international trade, what a CBAM might look like in the US. thinking about carbon pricing as a new policy lever that DC might leverage. Then I'm going to talk about the actual in the trenches examples. But first I want to talk about what a typical academic project looks like. And I'll use my own research as an example. So I've done a lot of work on thinking about what a decarbonized transportation sector looks like and how can we efficiently decarbonize the light-duty sector in a way that is fairly equitable, doesn't lean too heavily on critical minerals that we don't necessarily have, and can serve as a glide path to a completely decarbonized system over the next couple decades. I've written lots and lots of papers. I was just shocked when I learned after writing these papers that, President Obama wasn't calling me and saying, hey, I noticed table 6 on page 54. That's the key result, right? I don't think he even got to page 54. That's the shock. So after a while, I said, all right, I got to get this out there. This is great work. I got to get this out there. So myself and a colleague wrote a couple op-eds actually on this topic. And we said, all right, now we're done, right? We'll see legislation next week. And then it just died, right? And that's the typical lifespan of academic work, at least as it impacts climate. So that's what we're trying to fix. So let me give you another example, the first project. And this is great because it would have died if the Climate Policy Center wasn't stood up. So around January, I think, Senator Hickenlooper from Colorado called Drew Story at what's called the MIT Policy Lab. The reason why for the call is Senator Hickenlooper has a big wires act that would require more transmission to be built, interregional transmission to be built, to increase resiliency, increase the investment in renewables and so on. So he called Drew and he said, look, I noticed that there's this researcher at MIT that wrote a paper on this exact topic. Can you help him, or can you ask him to analyze the Big Wires Act for us? We'd like to know exactly what the impacts are. Drew went to the MIT Energy Initiative, which is where this researcher sits, and talked to the researcher. I won't give his name. He's actually on the project, so you might be able to see who he is in a second. But that researcher said, Drew, look, I would love to do this, but I can't. I'm a research scientist. I'm on soft money. I'm working on 5 grants right now, and I'm trying to get my 6th grant so I could have funding for the next year. I just can't do this. I would love to do this. So had the Climate Policy Center not been stood up, it would have stopped right there. Drew would have went back to Hickenlooper's staff and said, sorry, we can't do this. Luckily, back in the fall, I hired a postdoc to serve as the kind of demonstration project for what the Climate Policy Center might look like. That postdoc is Juan Senga, there's the picture there. I hired him within the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. That's the other center I run. And I said, look, you're going to work on academic work, but if we see something that we could use the tools at MIT to model and to analyze, we're going to drop all that academic work and focus on that. Juan was very excited to do that. So I had him learn the MIT Energy Initiative's Gen X model, which is this model that can model the electricity grid and what it might look like under different scenarios. Drew got wind of that and came to me and Juan and said, can you do this? Juan said, I'd love to do this, okay? The next thing that we had to fix is Hickenlooper's staff said, all right, great, 3 weeks, okay? Juan, being the superstar he is, did it in 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, we are in Hickenlooper's office in DC, briefing his staff and his co-sponsor staff on the analysis of the Big Wires Act that we did. We wrote a little paper so that they had something to cite, and that's the beauty of this project, is that paper is going to turn into an academic journal article. It's just going to take a lot longer than what the Hickenlooper staff has. So we're now writing the full academic paper and submitting that to a journal. A week after that meeting, our numbers are in their press releases. Our numbers are being used to get more co-sponsors on board to get the bill actually passed. Is it going to pass? I'm not sure. But I could say we had a positive impact on the probability that it would pass. That's the first success story. Then, this is the snowballing effect. Representative Cesar from Texas has another bill that's somewhat related that would require Texas to interconnect to one of the other two grids in the US. It's a really cool story how Texas is its own little island in terms of the electricity grid. They do that because if they're their own island all within Texas, then they don't face federal regulation, right? But they do that at the detriment of things like Winter Storm Uri, which hit Texas, and now Texas can't import power, even though 50, 60% of their electricity generation is down. So Representative Cesar's bill would require them to interconnect to build up the resiliency. They heard what we did for Hickenlooper staff and said, can you do the same thing for our bill? We did that in 1 week. We didn't need the 2 extra weeks because we already had the infrastructure in place. This is, don't let it out. On Monday, this paper will be released, and Representative Cesar will have another press release citing this research, trying to get more co-sponsors on board. So that's the snowballing effect that already representatives and senators know that MIT is here to help them in terms of this sort of research. So I have a couple other examples, but I did want to have a conversation. But this is a state example. Maybe I'll end here, where, again, I've been doing some work with researchers at the Salata Institute at Harvard. Even though we're better than Harvard, we're still going to work with Harvard, right? We're not going to cut those ties. So we've written a fair number of papers that have shown that in the current state of electric vehicles, the thing that's holding back EV penetration is less about the price of the vehicle and more about the lack of a charging network. So we've written academic work showing that if you moved money from subsidizing the vehicles to subsidizing charging stations, you would be way more effective. You can get the same penetration of EVs at a much lower price and so on. So that's the academic work that we published. But Jim Stock, who's a co-author on that work and who runs the Salata Institute, Jim and I both believe that you got to do more from this. So what we did is we went out and hired Elaine Buckberg, who's the former chief economist at GM, and we hired Elaine to be kind of the point person to get this research out there and to get it translated into actual policy. The first thing we did for that is we had a convening where we brought in all the stakeholders here, not just the charging stations and not just the vehicle manufacturers, but the companies like Walmart and places that want to also partner with charging networks, and regulators from California and New York and the federal government at INRAIL. But that wasn't enough either. So the next thing Jim and I did is we had conversations with the senator, a state senator here, and we learned the timing was perfect that a new climate bill is being written right now over at Beacon Hill. So what we've been doing with him and his staff is actually helping them craft the legislation, craft the actual language of what would go into the bill that would augment and amplify the number of charging stations and provide real-time data for EV customers to be able to know which charging stations are working and so on. So will this pass? I don't know, but they have the language, and I had a conversation with that senator today on this very topic. So those are the types of things that we hope to do with the Climate Policy Center. Again, take that academic research and turn it into actual legislation. So some questions for you, how can we improve on the model? Like I said, this is new. I think it's very unique. There's not another example like this out there, I would say. There are some things that are close at other universities, but I think they're different in some important ways. What can we do to assure success? And what can we do to build those relationships, whether it's between you and me, other policymakers, other industry, and so on? I'd really love for your feedback. Thank you very much. Should I just? Sure.
Hi, Frank Gillette, class of 93. I have experience in the technology industry as a industry analyst. And what I didn't hear you talking about as one of the constituents is the industry analysts in this area, such as Wood Mackenzie and others, as part of your outreach. And I'm just curious, when you think about stakeholders, are they in scope, and what other stakeholders maybe are part of that broader picture to increase the visibility and effectiveness of MIT's work?
Yeah, that's a great point. They are an integral part of this. In fact, we've been talking with WoodMac. I was gonna thumb back to Catherine's picture, but Catherine is doing work right now related to the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, trying to understand its impacts on the aluminum industry and the steel industry. So we're working with WoodMac to use their data on the aluminum industry and the steel industry so that she could generate those results to think about the impact. So, and they have researchers that are already doing very similar work. So if there are collaborative potential across industries, other universities, that is definitely fair game. Yeah.
Examples you pointed out were essentially missing pieces, whether capacity constraints, whether it be the Texas ECOT or the charging stations. So essentially, where can you have the highest ROI because there's a missing piece? All the technology, other things might be there, but there's a missing piece. I'm wondering, how can you focus that? Because I feel like in many cases, what's holding us back is not that we don't have the technology, it's just sort of no one's thinking about the system as a whole.
Yeah.
And also, to your point about 1,000 flowers blooming, research may be doing really interesting things, but it might be something that ultimately is 20, 30 years out, and having a feedback loop to help inform colleagues here at the Institute that we really need work in this area. So how to kind of focus on those sort of pinch points where it feels like people have been doing research on this for decades, right? But we're at the moment where we need to move things quickly. And so it's really breaking through those barriers where there's a missing piece like charging capacity, et cetera. How do you get the feedback loop also to, well, first to translate more, identify more of those choke points, but also the feedback loop to researchers to focus their efforts where it's going to be most impactful?
Yeah, I think that's right. That certainly to go very deep into decarbonization, we have the technologies that we need. We might quibble over the last 10 or 20%, but we can get really far down the path with what we have. And yeah, so your kind of intuition is correct, that in many places we have these bottlenecks, so to speak, that's keeping things from happening. For example, believe it or not, if you go out and buy some land, buy the photovoltaic panels, and build a solar farm, and go to a state or go to an independent system operator and say, I'd like to connect my solar farm now, they'll come back to you and say, okay, it'll take 4 years. In many places, that's 6 years, right? Or on the transmission piece, that we know we need transmission corridors that connect where the wind blows to population centers and so on. And then you have the EV example. So we do know where these, or we have some idea sometimes where these bottlenecks are. So we're actually working on that interconnection delay as well and thinking about, so this is, I think, a longer project, certainly not 3 weeks, but can we use AI to figure out where the easiest places are to interconnect renewables into the grid? Can we hold the policymakers' hands and walk them through what that AI system might look like? Where the MIT research could come from is using these models like GenX to find the for lack of a better term, the highest shadow values, right? Where the bottlenecks actually are. And if you had done that, and that's kind of what our EV work did, which is nobody knew this result, that we should be spending money on charging systems and not the EVs themselves. That's where the research can inform where those high shadow values are. Yeah. Could I go up there?
Thanks. Have you considered partnering with another great MIT-sourced, relatively local organization, Union of Concerned Scientists, which has been trying to, they've got 50 years of Washington policy experience.
Yeah. We're open to collaborating with all sorts of organizations. And one of the things Bethany and I are doing are just meeting with organizations like that. We haven't met with the Union of Concerned Scientists, but we spent a Monday a couple weeks ago just meeting with think tanks and staffers and lobbyists and just trying to get a lay of the land on what that might look like.
Would you like me to put that together?
Sure. Here.
Hi, I'm Casey Kern, MBA 14. So it seems like many of these initiatives are focused on either carbon emission reduction or increasing efficiency. I'm curious about the other side of the equation about carbon capture. And countries in tropical regions are much better suited to do that kind of initiative than the U.S. And you did allude to an international component to this. I wonder, I know like Ghana has, they're treating their rainforests as like strategic carbon capture devices and things like that. What is the diplomatic angle to this, if any?
Yeah. So I think fairly early on, we're gonna have to think about a few focus areas, at least for now. And we probably don't have the staff to do everything, but Bob Pindyke, my colleague, some of you have probably took Bob's class. He actually is now using the word retirement, which is shocking if you took his class. But he's done some great recent academic work that has traced the supply curve for carbon reductions in forests. And he and I met a couple weeks ago, and he's like, it was the classic problem. He's like, for some reason, policymakers aren't calling me to talk about this research. So that actually is one topic area that we might be able to focus on because we've done the academic work related to that issue. So international topics are definitely on our radar. We want to be able to identify topics that MIT already has research on, or faculty or researchers that can work on that. But I'd love to talk with any of you on that exact issue, and I could put you in contact with Bob if you know people in that space. Yeah, up there.
Hi, I'm class of '99, and I have an observation, which is MIT used to have a lot of clout in Washington when Chuck Vest was president, and I think that was because he was around for so long, and so he got to know everybody in a certain way, and the Union of Concerned Scientists has a long-standing relationship, which seems fruitful. But I also think that finding ways to have industry champion your stuff is key, because we do live in a political system where money talks. And I haven't heard how industry is being folded into this. McKinsey is one thing, but General Motors is another.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say we will definitely be talking with them. We're still having conversations internally about what the funding model might look like going forward, whether we would collaborate or be industry funded. So that's also on the table. The other center I run, Center for Energy Environmental Policy Research, that is industry funded. We have 30 companies, not just energy companies, but companies outside of energy like Liberty Mutual and so on and so forth. And so even if the Climate Policy Center itself doesn't have industry sponsors, we will have an advisory board drawn from industry. And we will also collaborate with the centers on campus that are industry funded. In fact, last Monday, we were at the acronym is MCSC. So it's the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortia, which is all non-energy company consortia. And we had a listen and learn conversation with them to think about how we could help with their industry sponsors as well. So rest assured, industry is going to be an important part of this process.
Hi, Daniel Aronson, 99. There's the other part of this, which I'm just curious how much you're doing, bringing in the political scientists, and because policy is not primarily about the facts as much as it is about the coalitions and getting things across the finish lines.
Yep.
And there's a bunch of good work on how that actually works. For example, people used to test messages without the counter message, and it turns out that doesn't work. You have to test the message of what you're proposing and what the opponents will say to know if it's politically viable. Anyway, there's a lot of this, but I'm wondering how you're bringing that in, because if you want to have influence, the answer is the beginning, but not the end.
Yeah. So I briefly mentioned it, the MIT Policy Lab, which sits inside of the political science department. That story about Drew Story getting the call from Hickenlooper's office. Drew is at the Policy Lab. So Chap Lawson, who's a political scientist here at MIT, runs that lab. And actually Bethany and I had a phone call conversation with him this week about how can we share Drew and how could we share learnings across the different centers. So rest assured, the political scientists are also on our radar. We have great work within Sloan by David Rand, who's a behavioral psychologist who does that exact testing as well. And he has had some research in the energy space. I have plans to sit down with him and think about how we could leverage his laboratory and experimental research within the Climate Policy Center as well. That's a good point. Yeah.
My name is Skip Page. I'm class of 84, and this is really an out-of-the-box question. I got to tell you first that it seems like a lot of money and efforts being spent to stop the Earth's temperature from increasing. And has anybody considered that efforts might be better spent to just accept that temperatures are going to increase and try to develop solutions to reduce the impact around the world? I'm really not a pessimist.
No, it's a fair point. Look, I think the climate scientists agree that 1.5 degrees is in our radar. 2 degrees, we might be able to limit to 2 degrees, but the climate has changed, and we're unlikely, unless direct air capture and negative emission technologies get a lot cheaper, we're unlikely to have the appetite to actually reverse a lot of the climate change that has already taken place. So it shouldn't be a dirty word, and the word is adaptation. We need to think about how do we build more resilient communities to the climate change that has already taken place. And we are having those conversations, and especially with coastal states that face this burden already. We've had conversations with policymakers in Louisiana on this very issue. Last week, I held a conference in Lisbon on climate adaptation. It was focused on wildfires and how do we adapt to wildfire risks and so on. So it shouldn't be a dirty word. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
But you're an economist. It might be cheaper to just deal with it than to try to stop it.
I think the internal solution is usually the solution. We tend not to have corner solutions. And given that we've already had the climate change, even if we stopped emissions today, the climate is going to continue to heat up or change over the next decades, if not centuries. So it has to be on our list of things. Yeah.
Class 2014, and I'm wondering, as you are designing the goals for your organization and how you plan to have an impact in the world, what are your thoughts around creating it a financially driven organization where maybe some of these 1,000 flowers that you have become a license or MIT seal, and then you may have a consulting group of people that come in and help to maximize the impact and the number of instances in which you can touch on policymakers globally.
Yeah.
It's academia, but there are many ways to play this, and it seems to me that the most instances of touch with policymakers you may have, you'll be achieving your goal the best.
Yeah, that's not something economists typically do, but other disciplines definitely do. John Sturman's Inroads model spun off a nonprofit called Climate Interactive, which is a nonprofit organization that's meant to augment the tool itself and to get it out there. So that's certainly something to think about. The MIT Energy Initiative, recently one of the research scientists there spun out a model that they developed called the Sesame model, which is measures life cycle emissions of different technologies, with the hopes of building more financial resources to get that research out there. So there may be opportunities to do something like that. Yeah.
Or are you trying to get them to want your product? Like, where's the highest leverage point if you put like the same organizational change model? How do you focus on that leverage point and look at it from a customer perspective?
Yeah. So I think that our main customers are the policymakers themselves, but industry can be a customer if they want to understand how policies are going to impact their industry or things like that. I also think our customers are our students. Our customers should always be our students at a university. You know, do they want our product? We already see that some of them do. I think more do, but just don't know the product we have, right? And we should be constantly looking for holes. What products don't we have that would be most useful to policymakers? So that's really, I think, over the next couple years, leveraging the tools we've already developed and building new tools that provide them with more information and more objective work. So using the Hickenlooper bill, you know, they came to us and they said, we'd like answers to these 5 questions. And believe it or not, climate was 5th, right? Because Hickenlooper wants people from the other side of the aisle to sign up to the bill, right? So the first 2 were resiliency and reliability, right? The next one was jobs, which we said we can't do that. Those numbers are always made up. So that's where the objectivity shows up. We won't give them everything they want, right? We'll give them things that we believe in. The 4th thing was cost. What would it do to the cost of the grid and so on? And then 5th was climate. So those are the types of things they want to know what their proposed legislation would do to market outcomes, and that's what we could provide them. Yes, yeah. They don't get to page 54. Yeah, the papers we wrote were 3 pages, right? And lots of visuals. Yeah. Last question.
Regenerative agriculture has all sorts of different benefits for the planet and for the consumers, but it's also been praised as being able to bring down climate. But I think it's hard to track that. I'm curious, how much does that fit into the overall system, and is that actually a solution for some of our carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so it's not a topic that MIT has focused a lot on, but there's another research group on campus called the Joint Program for Technology and Climate Change. They do have a big component that is on ag and thinking about things like biochar and rebuilding forests and so on, but thinking about how the whole agricultural sector fits into the space. Often they get a free pass, for political reasons. And because of that, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the ag industry because they haven't had to do much. So does that take the form of offsets, or does that, what are the policy tools that we could leverage? If we want to leave them unregulated, how could we pick that low-hanging fruit in the agricultural industry? That is something that groups on campus have been thinking about. Yeah. Thank you very much.